Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalan Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Lissa Rankin. Dr. Rankin is a New York Times best-selling author, a mind-body medicine physician, founder of the Whole Health Medicine Institute, and the nonprofit Heal at Last. Dr. Rankin is an encaustic artist who researches radical remission, trauma-informed medicine, and spiritual healing. Dr. Rankin's TEDx talks have been viewed over 6 million times. She starred in 2 national public television specials, and she's currently co-writing her 8th book, U-Turn, about the link between narcissistic abuse and medical illness, focusing on how healthy boundaries and internal family systems therapy can reverse diseases related to nervous system dysregulation caused by relational trauma. Throughout her lifelong journey as a healer, Dr. Rankin has come to realize that all roads led to the same conclusion. People who are not responding to traditional medicine often have untreated, unhealed trauma, and treating that trauma can sometimes lead to seemingly miraculous radical remissions. So, Dr. Rankin, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Jalan. Thank you for inviting me.
Also, I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about how you got to who and where you are today?
Well, yeah, I wrote a whole book about it called The Anatomy of a Calling that you and I were just talking about. So it's a long story, but I'll give you sort of the shorthand. I was raised in a family with a fundamentalist Christian mother and a physician father. And so in my mother's world, like anything in the realm of, anything outside of her religious framework was the work of the devil. And in my father's framework, from, being a conventionally trained doctor whose parents were, in the church, his dad was a minister, his uncle is a minister. He had this sort of skeptical scientist side. And so he sort of poo-pooed and had contempt for anything outside of the skeptical science perspective as like charlatanism, snake oil, whatever. So between my mom and my dad, me winding up where I am now is like nearly a statistical impossibility because so much of my work has become about the intersection of science and spirituality, and that those places where they overlap, but without the indoctrination and dogma and culty stuff of my mother's fundamentalism, and also without the rigid, dogmatic upbringing that I had in my medical education that kind of came from my father. So I was raised very much in the indoctrination of my father, primarily. I left the church at 18, so I let go of my mother's indoctrination quite young. But I trained at places like Duke University and Northwestern University and had this sort of very traditional, conventional medical training. And I became extremely disillusioned with it. I was very naive and idealistic going in. I wanted to save the world. I wanted to save lives. I wanted to help people heal. And I figured out pretty quickly that, when I started my OBGYN practice in San Diego in 1999, I was expected to see 25 patients a day. And by the time I left the hospital in 2007, I was expected to see 40 patients a day, which means I was often double booked in 15-minute slots. So I had 7.5 minutes with a person. And especially for gynecology and obstetrics, like these are vulnerable situations. It's impossible to do any healing work in 7.5 minutes. So I wound up, burned out. At Harvard, there's a couple of Harvard doctors that are now talking about how physicians aren't actually burned out, we're morally injured. And that moral injury, that term came from return war veterans who were obeying orders. So they were doing as they were told, but they knew that what they were doing was wrong. And I felt like that. I felt like I was doing what I had been trained to do. I was following the rules of how to be a conventional medical doctor, and I knew it was wrong. And I hit a threshold where, the medical system gives lip service to caring about patient well-being, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's beholden to the financial bottom line. And that makes the whole system corrupt. And no matter how well-intentioned doctors are going into medical school, and I think most of us are very naive and idealistic and well-intentioned. If you wind up cooperating with a corrupt system, you wind up sort of selling your soul for a stable paycheck. And I was the only breadwinner in my family. My husband was not working. I was pregnant with my only child when I was in 2006. She was born in January of 2006. And I left the hospital in January of 2007. So I was a young mom now with no income. My husband still wasn't interested in working. We're now divorced in part because of that. And I thought I was leaving medicine for good. I'm also an artist. And so I thought, well, I'll just focus on my art and we'll downsize and I'll make a living with my art. And I realized about 9 months after I quit, and it was quite noticeable to me that it was the 9-month mark, given that I'm an OBGYN, that there about 9 months afterwards, I felt like something was missing. I wasn't satisfied just being in the art studio all day. I was missing that sense of mission and purpose that had driven me to medical school in the beginning. And I had gone to medical school the way some people go to the priesthood. It was like a spiritual calling, very young. And so I felt like I came to say that you can quit your job, but you can't quit your calling. And so there was that sort of desire to come back to medicine, but I had to do it on my own terms, and I had to do it in a way that didn't feel like I was selling my soul or hurting people. Like I had, and that took quite some time. So it wasn't really until about 2009, 2010, that I had sort of figured out how to be a doctor outside of the hospital, outside of a conventional practice, mostly as an online educator. And I started training physicians in the Whole Health Medicine Institute and working with patients and writing books. I'm a full-time writer. I've been writing since 2007, I guess. And so I've sort of had to find a new way into that and it became a big part of my research. So I've spent since 2008 researching what really makes people sick, what really helps them get better beyond conventional medicine. Because again, I've never abandoned my training. During the pandemic, I was like, follow public health measures, get your vaccination, like obey the public health guidelines of conventional medicine. I'm not anti-medicine at all. I absolutely would go to the hospital if I had, a severe medical condition. So I haven't rejected the training that I came from. I just have added to it a lot of other understandings that I wasn't taught in medical school. I just wrote something for a class that I taught called 44 Revelations they didn't teach me in medical school, because it's been an incredible journey of educating myself about stuff I absolutely should have been taught in medical school. And so that's part of my current mission and purpose, is to bring some of these bits of awareness into medical education, to work with medical students and residents. My partner is medical director of the inpatient psychiatric hospital at Harvard, and a medical school professor. And so the two of us are really working to try to get some of this into the Harvard systems, to get some mainstream validation around some of these things that my father would have thought were quite woo. And I don't think they're woo at all. This is like absolutely evidence-based, evidence-based stuff that I'm talking about here. It's not like charlatanism and snake oil, as my father would have thought. And I'm particularly interested. So my particular specialty around all of that became, in Mind Over Medicine, the scientific proof that you can heal yourself was the subtitle. I was really interested in all of the aspects of health outside of what we learned in medical school, or outside of what your doctor is probably telling you, that impact health outcomes. Things like your relationships, your work environment, your creativity, your spirituality, your sexuality, your finances, your living environment, not just what you eat, whether you exercise, how many medicines or supplements you take, whatever, but all those other aspects of what it means to be a whole human being, and the impact on the nervous system of all of those things can be medicine or they can be poison. Your relationships can be absolutely medicinal or they can be completely toxic and poisonous. And how do we orient ourselves to optimize those aspects of our life to make them medicinal and not poisonous? And that was really what Mind Over Medicine was about. But I became quite interested in radical remissions because of that research. I did not understand what that was all about. That was how I met my partner, Jeffrey Rediger. He started researching radical remissions as well in 2003. I started in 2008. And he was being very rigorous about before and after medical testing, having all of the records and really figuring out like what did these people do to people with stage 4 cancer who did not get conventional medical treatment. How in the world did they get better? And what did they do? And it turned out that these spontaneous remissions were not at all spontaneous. So that work then led me into 10 years of research for my book, Sacred Medicine, which was really looking more into the spiritual healing realm, the faith healing, the energy healing. Like, what's that? And is it real? And if it is real, what can we learn from it? And if it's not real, what do we need to understand about the shadow of that side, which became a big part of that research, was the shadow of that side of medicine. And that led me ultimately into the trauma healing world, because I realized, like, wow, these energy healers, they're doing trauma healing work badly. A lot of them, like, they're opening up people's traumatic history, but they're not trained as therapists. They're not, and they can be quite dangerous. They can harm people. They can cause, lead to suicides and psychosis and overdoses and like lethal kinds of side effects from having that traumatic material not handled safely, or even re-traumatizing people, as some of them have done. Like John of God, the alleged spiritual healer in Brazil, is now in jail for over 500 counts of Me Too violations, sexual assault and rape. So, obviously that's not medicine, that's poison. So, that book came out in 2021, Sacred Medicine. And, about halfway through that 10-year research experience, I started training in a lot of the various trauma healing methodologies, internal family systems, which I've been working with that system for 10 years now. That's the one that I know the best. But I also did some training in somatic experiencing and neuroaffective relational model and advanced integrative therapy, AIT, in relational life therapy, RLT. So I've read 100 books probably. I've been teaching with Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS. I've been teaching with some of the somatic experiencing people, with the NARM people, and Gabor Mate and I have taught together around a lot of this. So I sort of have wound up in this kind of unusual space of being a medical doctor who is teaching trauma healing methods as adjunctive medical treatment for people who are sick. So that's kind of my weird specialty now. It's kind of a trauma-informed approach to medical conditions. Working with parts, for example, I'm about to teach with Frank Anderson. We're teaching a class called IFS as Medical Treatment, June 8th and 9th on Zoom. That's specifically working with people who have chronic or life-threatening medical conditions, or with therapists or physicians who are working with that population, about how to use IFS to get to know the parts that might be protectors or firefighters in the IFS language, that might be using the body to get core needs met, that the system hasn't figured out how to get those needs met any other way. Like, they're absolutely valid and important protectors. So yeah, that's my current area of interest, and it's what my partner Jeff Rediger and I are writing a book about right now.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, that was the short answer.
I think that what you're doing is so important and so necessary, because without that integration, there may not ever be those radical remissions that you were speaking of, or the type of healing that you've seen from what you're doing. So thank you for that.
It's an honor to do this work, really.
You've always been somewhat of a healer. When was it that you realized your inner knowing about your calling? How old were you?
Well, I was 7. um, I didn't call it that at the time, but I was 7 years old when my parents were cleaning. They hired a chimney sweep to clean out the chimney, and the chimney sweep found a nest of newborn baby squirrels. Like, they didn't even have their fur yet. They were like little bald rats, you know. And my mother was trying to teach me about the cycle of life, and these babies will now die because they've been abandoned by their mother, and I was having none of that. And I insisted that my parents take me to the veterinarian and that I wanted to get help for these little baby squirrels. And anyway, it was a long story, but I wound up taking care of something like 30 squirrels between the age of 7 all through college, until I went to medical school and started learning how to help and heal humans. I was the squirrel girl. I got named this from the local newspaper. They did a whole article on me with all the squirrels on my shoulders, and wrote this whole story about the girl who heals squirrels. And the neighbors would bring me squirrels that they would find that were injured or abandoned, little babies or injured adults. And I became the squirrel girl. And the vet taught me basically what to do with baby squirrels. And I had them in little incubators with heating lights and polyester fiber fill. And I'd have to wipe their little bottoms and help them go to the bathroom and feed them with a bottle. And my school let me bring the squirrels to school. So I had a tote bag that they would live in when I was at school. So yeah, I started young.
That's awesome. Um, your journey to who and where you are today is quite a fascinating story. And I think that your relationship with medicine has changed so much. Um, when you were an OBGYN, how would you say your relationship with medicine was then?
When I was starting as an OBGYN, or when I finished?
Or just as during while you were practicing? Or
Um,
when you finished,
I
when you
mean, I
finished.
was very, yeah, because the reason I asked is it changed. It
Right.
changed a lot between when I started and when I finished. I would say when I finished my training at Northwestern and I started my practice, I was like absolutely 100% evangelist for evidence-based medicine the Northwestern way. Um,
Mm.
and I was sure that I knew. I was such an arrogant little whippersnapper. I like called all the doctors at the hospital to prove to them that what they were doing was not the most evidence-based, up-to-date, cutting edge way of practicing. Um, so I was a very effective sort of, um, yeah, evangelist is the word that comes to mind for that indoctrination. And I really believed that if we followed the evidence-based medicine model to the T, that was the best possible health outcome. And I shared my father's skepticism for anything outside of that. And I got humbled. I got humbled from that place over time, and look back with embarrassment at the parts that were so certain, and so certain that what I had learned in my medical education made me smarter, better, more certain than people with 30 years of clinical experience
Mm.
doing what they had been doing for a long time. And I also was really humbled after I left and started meeting people in the alternative medicine space who were so kind to me. They were so kind to each other. They were so kind to their clients. And they were much happier than the doctors that I knew. And I became very curious about what they were up to and what they were offering and how it was different than physicians and what we were offering. And like I said, I felt really ashamed. I felt like we had really, like I had been part of a system that marginalized those healers, and that put myself one up above them. And that's how I had been indoctrinated to do. And yet they were doing something that I thought was really important. They were meeting a need, especially a relational need. They were meeting a nervous system regulation need. They were meeting an empathic need, an intuitive need, many of the things that had been cut out of conventional medicine, many of those even feminine principle things like compassion, empathy, intuition, safe touch, things that I was mocked for as a doctor. I was mocked during my medical training if I offered that. Like I was basically trained that I had to become more masculine than the men in order to rise to the top and get any respect within a very patriarchal, very sexist system. And my medical training was like just a shit show of sexual harassment and just sexism in general, like criminal levels of assault and inappropriate behavior. So that was a big deal for me to kind of come back around to reclaiming those exiled parts of myself that I had as the squirrel girl, but that medical school kind of, humiliated me out of, or pressured me out of, or forced me out of. And so much of that journey of reclamation has been coming back around to incorporate those aspects of the role of the healer for my own parts first, and then for patients and for other physicians and other healers who are kind of trying to practice a more humane, more empathic, more well-rounded kind of medicine.
So in contrast to what it was, and I guess you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but just to drive the point home, how would you say your relationship with medicine is now?
Well, it's conflicted. I would say I have polarized parts. I'm very grateful. So some of my parts are very grateful for conventional medicine, because conventional medicine increased human life expectancy by 30 years within a 100-year period. 30 years. That's incredible. We used to die of infectious disease at 40, women didn't survive childbirth. Babies didn't survive infancy. Like we used to have, as humans, we used to have so much loss. I mean, think about that. Think about what it must have been like to lose your wife in childbirth, to lose your child, to lose a 40-year-old man, to how much loss we as humans experienced. So I'm very grateful. Most of that was because of vaccination and antibiotics and sterile technique, right? You put those three things together and 30 years. So that's incredible. Conventional medicine does actually save lives. And for the things that it's good at, it's absolutely fantastic. I say I have polarized parts because I also just feel hopeless about the American medical system in particular. Like we could have the best medical system in the entire world, and we have one of the worst. Because it's a for-profit model, and that is absolutely unethical. I think it is absolutely unethical to have a for-profit medical system. And, the people that have the most power are actually the executives. They're not even doctors. And the doctors, I believe, really do care about patient well-being. They might get burned out and lose some of their empathy from their own trauma. But they went to medical school for good intentions. They have very altruistic and humanistic, intentions. I've been working with doctors for years. They are good people. But the administrators that are responsible for running the system, they are not. They are sociopaths, some of them. They do not care about patient outcomes. They care about money. And and that's tragic, because it hurts everybody except the sociopathic middlemen who walk home with, $5 million paychecks. So that the rise of managed care has absolutely destroyed medicine, I think. But I also believe we must have socialized medicine. We should have government supported medicine. Nobody should have to pay for basic medical care. That should be a right, not a privilege. And the fact that people have to pay out of pocket and so many people are uninsured and the quality of care that people get is just severely compromised if they don't have good for-profit paid, private insurance. That's tragic.
I agree. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And it definitely sounds like it's something you're passionate about. So I wanted to ask another
Yeah, and
question.
I also
Go ahead.
go ahead. No, you.
Okay. I was going to say, now that it seems like you have a healthier relationship with medicine, what have you learned about trauma as it relates to both mental and physical illness?
Well, so much. I mean, I'm about to teach an online Zoom course called Healing Medical Trauma. So
Mm.
there's that, right? It's like we actually get traumatized by the system. So that's part of what I've learned is like the medical system is traumatizing. We traumatize patients, we traumatize nurses and other healthcare providers, we traumatize alternative medical practitioners, we traumatize medical students, residents, and attending physicians. Everybody in the hospital is getting traumatized by doctors, including the doctors.
Mm.
And that's horrible, that we should be a place of healing, not traumatizing. I've only been in the hospital as a patient once, and I left against medical advice. That's how bad it was in my own hospital when I was giving birth. Like, I left 24 hours after surgery. I was supposed to be there for 3 or 4 days. And I was like, I can take better care of myself at home than the care I am
Mm.
getting in this hospital. It was absolutely traumatic. And I was a VIP in my own hospital. So if I'm getting treated that way, it's like, wow. So but it's taken me this long. This is the first time I'm tackling that subject. I became aware of it in 2013 when I was on my book tour for Mind Over Medicine, and I was going to hospitals where the people that were coming to see me, and I'd have a packed audience, they had all been impacted by the medical system. And I realized everybody in the room has PTSD around this issue, and they're all traumatized by doctors, including the doctors. But it was such like a Pandora's box. It feels like there's so much sensitivity there. Like I would walk into those rooms and everybody would be in tears. And
Mm.
there were some healings. It was like the nurses were hearing the doctors were hearing the patients, and there was some awareness and some healing around trying to understand it from the perspective of the other person. So first of all, medicine needs to stop being traumatizing. That would be a good head start. And then also I think medicine needs to have an awareness that 85 to 90% of what brings people to the doctor is related to a dysregulated nervous system. It's trauma induced or trauma related or trauma exacerbated or full on caused by trauma. And we have all of the data. This is the science. If anybody doesn't have buy-in for that and you doubt me, the science is actually really, really clear around this. Starting in the 90s with the Kaiser and CDC studies around adverse childhood experiences that show that if you have an ACE score, the ACE score being 10 common, significant traumas in the household that happen before you're 18, things like child abuse, childhood sexual abuse, having a parent that's incarcerated, having a parent with mental illness, substance abuse in the home, domestic violence in the home, things like this. There's 10 of those that don't even begin to cover all of the traumas that people experience. But you get 1 point for each trauma. And people with an ACE score of 7 or above, their life expectancy is reduced by 20 years. 20 years. It's that significant. It's like we almost lose the whole 30 years we got from conventional medicine because of those
Mm.
things. And that doesn't account for being a Black man in America, right? That doesn't account for being a war refugee. It doesn't account for being bullied at school. It doesn't account for any number of developmental traumas, like having a controlling parent or a perfectionistic parent, or not being allowed to individuate and become your own person, having to be the parentified child who becomes the parent of the other siblings or the parent of the parent. Those don't even get counted in the ACE score. So if we included, you can have an ACE score of 0 and have significant developmental trauma, or be at the mercy of significant collective trauma like white supremacy or sexism or homophobia. And all of those things are going to dysregulate the nervous system. Like you were saying, you were in chronic fight or flight. And even more significantly, some people are in chronic freeze and fawn, which is an even more severe level of threat that often looks like they're fine because they're dissociated.
Right.
They're frozen and checked out, and their consciousness is not really even embodied. It's like outside of the body because it's not safe to be in the body. And those people can, look really accommodating. They're placating. They're people pleasing. They're friendly. They're taking care of everybody else. They're caregivers, and they're completely self-neglecting. And so, illness is sometimes the only way people like that can actually get care for themselves because they're all outwardly focused. So that's really what I'm focusing on now, is trying to increase awareness of that. Trying to make sure physicians are aware of that we're doing ACE screening and other complete trauma screenings as part of any sort of intake for a medical condition, but especially for medical conditions that have failed conventional medical treatment. I think it's absolutely malpractice at this point to do any sort of oncology care without doing a trauma screen and referring to appropriate trauma therapy for anybody who, has a significant trauma burden. We should be doing oncology care plus working with the parts that might be involved there, working with healing and unburdening those exiles, if you want to use the IFS language, working with the protectors to soften and relax the protectors. And sometimes when we do that, if we can help people get creative about getting core needs met in ways that don't require the body to be an excuse, for example, let's say you always get migraines whenever your mother-in-law comes over. Well, if you have good boundaries and you can speak up and stand up on behalf of your parts and have good boundaries with your mother-in-law, then maybe you don't have to have the migraine that completely takes you out and gives you a good excuse not to have to deal with the toxic mother-in-law or whatever. So that's part of what Jeff and I are writing our current book about that pattern of sort of over caregiving, people pleasing, inability to say no, poor boundaries, as it relates to medical illness, because that was one of the things that we found was one of the most significant patterns that we found in the radical remission survivors, was that many of these people were lifelong doormats who got feisty and started standing up for themselves and started saying no and started having boundaries and started prioritizing their own parts, speaking up for their needs, making requests. And if other people didn't like it, like kicking them to the curb because like their lives were in danger. So, and some of those people had, very quick and surprising turnarounds of life-threatening medical conditions. And we were like, wow, what's that? It's almost like it mobilized all this energy that could then go towards healing rather than suppressing and avoiding and dissociating.
Right. And as someone starts to learn about all these things that you're talking about, they begin a journey. And in your book, The Anatomy of Calling, you speak about this and you refer to it as a hero's journey. And I wanted to ask if you could go in detail a bit about what a hero's journey is.
Well, that's based on Joseph Campbell, and it's sort of the patriarchal model, the hero's journey. There's also sort of the traditional heroine's journey, and we could talk about the differences between them. But if we put gender aside and we just say it's a recovery journey separate from patriarchy, separate from gender, the journey is really, in Joseph Campbell's model, it kind of starts with like the call to adventure or seeking, right? People sometimes have this point in their life where they've been in pain, but they've kept it down. They've been able to find other protectors that help them survive, and they don't really feel their pain so much. They've gotten through, and then something happens, and there's a rupture in the survival strategy, and some of that pain starts breaking through. And at that point, we either get better at pushing it down, which often means now we're getting medical symptoms, or
Mm.
we embark upon a quest that in the hero's journey is called the call to adventure. It's like the call to adventure. Like, what else? For some people, they sort of embark upon a spiritual journey. It's sort of a, like, they start spiritual seeking, right? And for others, it goes straight into more of a facing the pain headlong. Spiritual seeking can result in decades of spiritual bypassing, of using spirituality as a way to narcotize our parts and put our parts to sleep and temporarily feel better. But just like any addiction, you can get drunk on alcohol, you can get drunk on meditation, you can get drunk on spirituality. But just like any addiction or compulsive behavior, the more you do it, the more you get a tolerance for it, the more you have to do it, and the less effective it becomes over time. So then, like during the pandemic, for example, I think a lot of people that had been effectively spiritually bypassing, like it was kind of working for them, the trauma of 2020 just broke through that. And it was like, okay, it's time to do the trauma healing. And I think that's why we've had such an acute mental health crisis, in addition to many other factors, of course. So, and we saw a lot of people in the spiritual community really struggling and, going towards the QAnon and the pastel Q and all of that kind of disturbing conspiracy theories and things. But that call to adventure then leads to resistance, right? We have that impulse to go on the journey, and then we have the part that says, oh, no, that's too scary. I'm not going to answer that call to adventure. And then the next phase of that journey is the meeting of the mentor. Like, someone comes in that gives you courage. That's like, here, hold my hand. Like, we can do this together. And there's a leaving of the ordinary world meaning in my IFS language, sort of the world of blended with protectors. And we go into we cross the threshold into a different world. And in the traditional mythos, this would be like Dorothy is in Kansas and now she wakes up and she's in Oz. Like, she's now in a different world. And we enter this sort of mythopoetic, altered state almost of some of that part of the recovery journey where everything's upside down. Our compasses are backwards. Right is wrong. Like, we often have to get our moral compasses straightened out. We're confused. We're disoriented. But just like Dorothy, we meet friends along the way. We meet the cowardly lion and the Tin Man, and we get Toto, the little dog, or like we get our sidekicks that come with us. And then we have trials and things aren't going so well. And in the beginning, we might feel like it's quite magical. We have synchronicity. We're getting signs from the universe. We're feeling guided. And then all of a sudden, it's like, it's getting hard. Why isn't it working? Why did the signs go away? What happened to my sidekicks? And we wind up in the ordeal. And this is really where the rubber meets the road, where we are face to face with maybe an outer force or maybe an inner force. Maybe we're face to face with our own shadow. And I know in the trauma healing recovery journey, the early part is really hard because we have to face all the emotions of how we've been victimized. And then at some point, we have this horrifying realization that we have actually perpetrated trauma upon others as a side effect of the ways in which we have been victimized. And there's that reckoning, that sort of step 4 and step 5 in the 12-step model or whatever, where we're taking a moral inventory of our own life and coming face to face with how we've hurt people that we've loved because of our trauma. Like, because hurt people. And to be able to be compassionate with ourselves, to be able to find a way to understand ourselves, to stare ourselves in the face, to hold ourselves accountable, to try to make amends. And that's hard. That is hard work. It's hard, brave, badass work. So I have so much respect for people that are willing to do that, because it's so tempting to have parts that are defending, justifying, gaslighting, reversing victim and offender, blame shifting, like all the defenses that come in that try to prevent us from facing how we have hurt people. And if we can do that, then there are so many gifts that come from liberating those protectors from their burdened roles. There's so many gifts that come from unburdening the sort of magical child parts in us come back to life. And we get these sort of playful energies. We get these like sweet childlike parts, especially for those of us that were parentified children who had to become too mature, too responsible, too early, to be able to liberate some of those parts that get to have a childhood again. And then, I think the final part of that journey is such a sweet part, which is they say in the sort of mythological hero's journey, you get the Holy Grail. Like you're like, wow, I have this hard won wisdom. I have this gift, this iconic thing that I've now learned. And you could just stay in Oz, right? But Dorothy has to go back home. She has to go back. There's no place like home. But she gets to bring that Holy Grail back home. And for many of us, that becomes the passion of the calling of like, you're doing this podcast, right? You've been doing your own therapy. You've been working really hard. You've been in that crucible of the ordeal. And you're like, wow, there's gifts here. I want others who are still in the ordinary world. I want others who haven't embarked on the journey yet to know what I know. And you're passionate about it. And that is so noble. There's a nobility to that. There's like an altruism to that, to want to, help others who are still in pain, be free from some of that pain. It's so that sort of road home, that going back to the ordinary world, to bring the Holy Grail and share it with the people. And to be in an ideal world, this doesn't always happen, to be celebrated as a kind of initiation by those who are welcoming you back from, the hero goes to war in the sort of patriarchal warmongering model. And then the hero comes back home and is welcomed with a parade. So that doesn't always happen. Some people are not happy that we go on these journeys, and we might lose people. They might reject us because we're supposed to keep our secrets, or we're supposed to abide by some corrupt rules or whatever. So it doesn't always happen. But there are maybe not your family of origin, maybe not the people that led you to embark upon the journey, but there's a whole village of others that are now going to be able to relate to you in a whole different way. And where you can potentially be the teacher, or be the inspiration, be the mentor. And now you're the next person who holds the hand of someone brave who's getting the call to adventure and feeling that impulse. And now you get to be the one to say, I know a little bit about what's ahead. Come take my hand. I know it's scary, but let me lend you my courage. And then the cycle repeats, I think, for all of us. It's not like we ever finish. It's like we might complete one cycle and then it's like, whoa, new call to adventure, new quest.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I know as this journey, as someone starts to embark on this journey, it can be difficult to have a willingness to lean into those emotions, to see vulnerability as a strength. But there was something that you said in The Anatomy of the Calling, and I want to quote it. And I kind of pieced this together, but I think you'll recognize it. You said, keep your heart open no matter what. Choose love over and over until it feels like breathing. Let love be unconditional, but let access be completely conditional. If intimate access lies on a scale of 1 to 10, set the dial appropriately. So I wanted to ask you, for those who might be struggling with embarking on their journey, if you could use your platform to encourage anyone, what would you say?
Oh, wow. Well, that piece is really, really critical. I'm teaching in detail about exactly that on Substack right now. I wrote a book that I didn't publish the regular way, that I'm releasing on Substack, called The Boundaries Handbook. And that piece, I think it's so, especially people who are raised in religion or in New Age spirituality or in some sort of perfectionistic human world, we have these impulses towards unconditional love, right? We think that is the most noble way to be. but that can actually cause us to tolerate and enable abuse. And so to be able to be unconditionally loving to my own parts while also trying to be loving and accepting of other people and their parts, and to walk that razor's edge. It is a razor's edge. It's like if I go too far to one side, I'm selfish. I'm self-absorbed. It's all about me and my parts. If I go too far to the other side, I'm over caregiving. I'm martyring myself, my parts. I'm sacrificing to my own detriment. And to be able to walk that still point in between, where I am standing up and protecting my parts, I am also caring and extending generosity and compassion to other people's parts that might be hurting me or hurting others. And to find that path is a real lifelong practice. But part of it, that the intimacy dial, is one of the key things that I teach about unconditional love with unconditional access to our vulnerability is masochism. If someone is not safe, that is masochism. So what I say is unconditional love, conditional access. Conditional access meaning if someone is a 10 on the intimacy dial, that means they get to live in your house, sleep in your bed, eat out of your refrigerator, share your money, go on holidays with you, hear about your parts. You know, you might tell them what's happening in therapy, like really expose what's going on, right? That's a 10. But if somebody is shaming you because you're a man, you're not supposed to be vulnerable, Jalon, you're supposed to be the stoic, whatever stupid gender related stereotype that is out there for the conditioning of men in particular. If someone isn't holding those parts gently and safely, if they're not concerned and caring about your feelings, if they're abusive, if they're taking advantage of that access, then we simply have to dial the dial down, start withholding privileges in an ethical way until somebody can earn trust again. And trust is everything. If we can't have intimacy without trust, and trust is really difficult for trauma survivors. A lot of severe trauma survivors trust dangerous people and they don't trust safe people. They have like a backwards moral compass and a backwards discernment. So figuring those things out can be really tricky. So I'm writing a lot about that lately on my Substack if any of your readers are interested in learning more about that.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for this. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to do this with you. And thank you so much for sharing your story and your knowledge. If anyone wants to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
So my main website is lissarankin.com, LISSARANKIN.com. And that has all my online courses, and you can find my social media and my books and all of that. I'm at Lissa Rankin on Instagram and Lissa Rankin on Facebook. I mostly post on Facebook. And my Substack is lissarankinmd.substack.com.
Well, again, this has been so amazing. You have such a wealth of knowledge, and your ability to translate it for individuals who may not know yet what they're embarking on or what they're feeling or their emotional regulation, so on and so forth, you do an amazing job of it. So thank you for your time. Thank you for doing this with me. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for how you do it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And thank you to anybody who's listening. I know some of this material can be kind of activating for people, triggering. So I just want to say, if you stuck with us the whole time, thank you for being brave. And I know that's part of what you're doing here with this podcast, is encouraging people to have these hard conversations and talk about the stuff that is maybe cringy to talk about sometimes. So thank you for being a voice to help us all be able to talk about these things in as safe and gentle a way as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Rankin.